Welcome you all on behalf of the Lemelson-MIT Program and the authors lecture series of MIT and the MIT Press. I want to welcome you to this launching of our book, The Inventing Modern America from Microwave to Mouse. The book, by the way, was conceived by the staff of the Lemelson-MIT program for several years ago, well before I became associated with it. My name is Merton Flemings, by the way, on the faculty of MIT. By the staff, it was conceived by the staff of the program and Lester Thurow, and finally brought to fruition recently with the support of the Lemelson Foundation and with the authorship of David Brown, who is here. David, thank you very much. I might mention a few other distinguished people here. Apart from the panel members, there are several others associated with the book, which brings us all together here. Dr. Stan Ovshinsky, President and CEO of Energy Systems, and Mrs. Ethel Gross here, the wife of Al Gross, Dr. Al Gross. Mrs. Gross reminded me today, told me today, that it was just a year ago today that her husband was taken ill, and in the last few months of his life spent a great deal of time continuing to think inventive thoughts, and I think continuing to tell people about the important prize he won, and I'm sure it was more than one. The Lemelson-MIT program is, I want to express thanks to that also, not only for the support of the book, in part, but also for the support of our program at MIT, of our work in raising public consciousness of invention, of rewarding inventors, and now of our new program in focusing on promoting, encouraging high school students to invent and in invention. I'm happy to now introduce one of the sons of Jerry Lemelson and a member of the board of the foundation, of the Lemelson Foundation, Rob Lemelson, who will say just a word or two. Thank you.
Thanks, Mert. On behalf of the Lemelson Foundation, I'd like to start off by giving a deep note of gratitude and appreciation for this project, particularly to Lester Thurow and Mert Fleming, the new director, Kristen Finn, but particularly Anne-Marie Amparo, who was the director and shepherded the program really from its inception. I just want to mention a few things about the Lemelson Foundation. We were started by my dad in the early 90s with the sole purpose of promoting invention and innovation in America. And to that end, we have a National Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian, and I invite you all to go and visit there. We have the Lemelson-MIT program with our student prize, $30,000 student prize, and our $500,000 annual prize and our Lifetime Achievement Award. We have a National Collegiate Inventors and Innovators Alliance that we give numerous small grants to college inventors who otherwise wouldn't have the seed capital or ability to bring their inventions to market, and a number of other programs. Our new orientation for the foundation, our new direction, is bringing invention and innovation to address basic human needs in the developing world, and we're just getting that off the ground right now. I'm so delighted to be here, because this book really, it celebrates human imagination. And imagination can cut both ways, because it's possible to imagine a world without a world where our soldiers would be going to battle without the protection of Kevlar vests invented by Stephanie Kwolek, or the walkie-talkie invented by Al Gross. It's possible to imagine a world where millions wouldn't have their disease diagnosed with an MRI invented by Ray Damadian, or would have died without the benefit of a cardiac pacemaker by Wilson Greatbatch, or the balloon angioplasty by Thomas Fogarty. Where my favorite computer, the Macintosh, does not exist, by Steve Wozniak, and powered by my favorite input device, the mouse, by Douglas Engelbart. So that's the negative side. Now imagine a world where new polymers allow doctors to deliver targeted chemotherapy more effectively with fewer side effects and allow doctors to grow new bones or even internal organs by Rob Langer. Where computers can write poetry, stories, paint, or perhaps one day even debate and probably win debates of whether they're conscious beings, conceptualized by Ray Kurzweil, or in the future nanotechnology devices that can construct new materials, machines, and medications on a molecule-by-molecule basis by Brian Hubert. All of these inventors and their achievements have been honored through the awarding of the Lemelson-MIT Prize, either as grad students in the case of Brian, or the Inventor of the Year in case of Bob Langer and Ray Kurzweil, or our Lifetime Achievement Award winner Douglas Engelbart, all of whom are here today and will address you. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'll turn it back to Mert.
Well, it wasn't easy, but Rob and I have bit our lips and kept our comments almost as short as we planned to. And my happy job now is to turn the rest of the evening over to our host for the evening, Chris Lydon, founder and former host of Boston Public Radio's The Connection. Christopher.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and an extraordinary panel we have. It seemed to me the beauty of this book, or one of the many beauties of it, is that it's so personal, it's so biographical, as opposed to technical, much less ideological. And I thought we would try to keep the evening in that spirit. These are real people, men of imagination and a certain poetry, who have done these wonders, and I'd like to deal with them in that fashion. Rather than introduce them all formally, I'd like them to introduce themselves, but with a specific little trick question on which they've all been forewarned. I'd like each of them, starting with Doug Engelbart, to speak of their own kind of God as an inventor. I mean, who in the world of inventors really has sort of Joe DiMaggio kind of standing for them in terms of achievement, but in terms of a kind of emotional identity and example. Who's your Joe DiMaggio, Doug Engelbart?
I'm slow to make up my mind, so sometimes it's Edison, and sometimes it's Galileo, and sometimes it's Ben Franklin, and sometimes it's Aristotle. So, sorry.
Those are four heavy hitters. Edison, Aristotle, starting with Edison, ending with Aristotle, but you had Galileo and Ben Franklin. That's fascinating. Okay. That'll do. Leonardo is yet to be claimed.
I was going to say, could we possibly leave off Leonardo?
Brian, it's your turn. Well, I wondered, frankly, I was going to get to this later. How did this book leave out Edwin Land? But that's another matter. I don't mean to lead the witness. Go ahead. It's your turn, Brian.
Absolutely. Well, if I may be so bold as to point out actually a fine gentleman actually sitting in the audience, Stan Oshimsky, who has had a very long career. I'm still reading books that deal with his work on the study and development of amorphous thin film materials that date back to the 1955, 1960s, the development of memory films, and then switching over later on in life to CD development. So now these thin films are actually being used for mass storage and CD recording, and now, of course, solar cells as well. I'd like to point out another person, which I think maybe people don't necessarily consider an inventor outright, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright, an architect. He was, before the time of Frank Lloyd Wright, many buildings and architecture consisted of closed rooms that were separated one to another with a central hallway. And today we live in buildings and homes that have this kind of a free-flowing architecture to them. And in reality, maybe it's not patentable, but certainly it makes a big influence on our lives.
Thank you. Ray Kurzweil.
Well, I'll mention two people who had some influence on me, not in becoming an inventor, because I think I decided that before I'd heard of either of these people. But one is Edison, who I have learned something about later in life, and have tried to emulate some of the approaches and methods he used. He did have a specific discipline about inventing and saw himself specifically as an inventor and defined himself that way, and was one of the first to do that. And he had a whole methodology which involved being a student of technology trends and trying to anticipate where technology was going. The idea being that your invention has to make sense when you're finished with the project, not when you start, and the world will be a different place by the time you get the project done. And so that's led me to be a student of technology trends, and that kind of took on a life of its own. So I began to anticipate trends going out some decades, which enables me as a writer to invent with the technology capabilities and computational resources of future times. And Edison did that as well, and he kept very detailed logs of where technology was going and what might be possible today, but which inventions he might have to wait until certain other materials were available. He had a whole group process where he would actually, a large part of being an inventor is being a teacher and a salesperson. We try to inspire other people, not only your investors, but most particularly the other engineers and scientists that you're working with. And he had a whole group process, a whole laboratory devoted to invention. So I find his approach to be inspiring. Another person who's not really seen as an inventor, but Marvin Minsky actually was a mentor of mine going back quite early when I was in high school. I corresponded with him, and I came up here to Cambridge and met with him, and he had this vision of ultimately making computers as intelligent as people, and that really turned me on. It brought me here to MIT, and I've kept up that dialogue with Marvin for almost 40 years now.
Wow. Thank you. Robert Langer.
Well, for me, it's also a personal experience, and the man I would give is Dr. Judah Folkman, who is a professor at Harvard Medical School. He was my, after I graduated from MIT, he was the person I did my postdoctoral work with, and what he has done, as some people may have followed his career, is sort of invent a family of drugs that can stop how blood vessels grow, which is, I think, one of our great hopes today for possibly preventing cancer. But in addition to that, he's done a lot of other interesting things over a wide area, a wide spectrum, even doing some of the early work that led to the NOR plant, as well as a number of other things. But to me, it was not just the specific inventions, but more the attitude and more the way he looked at things. Like, he wasn't afraid to see the future, wasn't afraid to, in fact, was very interested in combining different disciplines. And he believed, I think, that anything was possible, and never gave up in the face of just enormous amounts of criticism. And I think these kinds of elements were wonderful for me as a young scientist to see, and have really inspired me throughout my life.
Fascinating. Steve Wozniak.
Yes, thinking back, I think of a lot of people that were really more like scientists, Galileo and Newton and Richard Feynman and all that, and I don't really think of them in the inventor category. And if I had a hero in life, I'd probably think back, well, God, it helped make me the way I am. It'd probably be Bob Dylan. So I go back, heck, I had all these things in me, like I'm sure all of us did, that were like inventors, very early in age, and 8 years old and on. And it was really had to be my father, who was an engineer, who I wanted to be like, and I told him in 6th grade, I want to be an engineer like you, and maybe second to that, a teacher, because they're important too. And my father was always there to help me, to teach me things, to answer questions, to inspire me to go a little further with my electronics work. I also had books that inspire you when you're young. You read a book, and for some reason it grabs you and kind of takes you in that direction in life. And there might have been some technical TV shows on, but for me it was books. And I would always buy the Tom Swift Jr. books about this guy who was young with his friend, and he was an engineer, and he owned a company with his father. And they just, whenever there was a problem in the world, he'd go into the lab for 2 weeks or 2 days and 2 days and nights and design a solution to entrap the aliens to fly, to win a spaceship race, to have a submarine to solve some problem. And
I
Tom
think these
Swift, that
authors
was
are
my early
not
hero,
credited
really.
enough. I
Yeah,
plug them.
but another good example of the author was I read a book, and it was just a bunch of people that had a little radio club that sent signals to each other, and a guy got kidnapped, and he outsmarted the kidnappers by wiring their TV to send some signals to his friends. And right after reading that book in 5th grade, I went to school and said, I'm going to get a ham radio license, because it said anybody of any age can get one. And it was just that neat little sentence at the end of the book that really inspired me. So I had a ham license by 6th grade, and pretty much from then on, I had an inventor's life. You could build things, and you know, you'd never really have to worry about having some sort of job. So that was a good book.
Thank you. Some of you have touched on it already. You're talking about Judah Volkmann's kind of courage about the future and a kind of can-do thing. But is there I'd like to ask anybody and plunge in, is there an X factor that separates, you know, a very good engineer from being an inventor, or a very good biologist from being, you know, Robert Langer? What is the difference between just a first-class professional and then and the kind of folk that invented modern America?
Well, you're looking at me?
Yeah, why not?
Well, I think there's probably a lot of answers to that. I'm sure everybody, you know, obviously there's things like creativity and brilliance. But I guess I go back to also thinking about, you know, a lot of time, I'll just give one element, and I think that everybody can maybe give different ones. I'm sure there's a lot. I think one thing is, and Ray has said this in different ways, about learning how to deal with failure. You know, the way I look at it is, you know, most of the time when you do stuff, when you try to invent, when you try to do science, things won't work. And so it's, you know, and so you can deal with that a lot of different ways. But I think a lot of times people that are most successful are the ones that know how to deal with failure the best, that just know, you know, aren't going to let that get the best of them. They'll just say, okay, I'm going to get it the next time, and eventually you do. In other words, it's just enormous amounts of perseverance, no matter what anybody says, no matter how hard something seems.
Yeah, well, Edison tried out several hundred filaments before he got one that worked. And usually, the only person who can declare failure is yourself when you finally give up and decide that you haven't been able to get something to work. But if you view failure as just success deferred, then you don't have to experience failure. Another aspect of the difference between a scientist and an inventor, and it's not really a value judgment. A scientist values knowledge. Knowledge does end up being useful in the end. But an inventor, at least speaking for myself, takes great pleasure in seeing what I call the leap from dry formulas on a blackboard to actual impact in people's lives. So actually seeing people use your inventions and have a benefit, and seeing it actually make a difference in the real world, that's what turns an inventor on. And usually an inventor is applying some scientific knowledge, but that's the sort of joy in inventing.
Doug, please.
Well, I bring in the strange word of a dreamer. That's what's driven me all the time, is sort of have dreams that are actually not have to be practical at all to be a dream, that you think, gee, that would be really neat. And so that's what's driven me all through the years, is the dream about how much people can collectively improve their ability to do complex urgent sort of solutions. And I remember how bothered I was when at one time some guy who was head of an ARPA division was quoted as saying, "Oh, Engelbart, he's just a dreamer." And God, it made me mad. The word "just." It's serious hard work.
Would you be more particular about, you know, particular dreams? You said, you know, that would be neat. And broaden it past the mouse, perhaps.
Oh, yeah. The mouse was just a little thing like a windshield wiper on a new brand of vehicles. And no, the whole thing started out over 50 years ago, and realizing that the world is really getting more and more complex all the time, and there are urgent big problems that have to be dealt with collectively, and the urgency difficulty is going up like this, and our collective ability is inching, if anything. And so it'd be very, very important to the world that we really learn how to boost our collective IQ, if I want to call it. So I dream about it. That's, boy, there really are opportunities to do that. And you can go. And
Can I just say, I like the dreaming idea, and it reminds me of a wonderful Dostoevsky story that everybody should read called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. And it's about a guy who's determined to kill himself on a particular night, and he has the revolver there, but he falls into a dream of sort of redeemed humanity and an alternative Earth, and he spends the rest of his life preaching about it. And he says, people come up to me and say, that's just a dream you had. And he said, yeah, but your reality made me want to kill myself, and it's the dream that told me the truth.
Something related to dreams is magic, and I was actually, one of the questions that I was prepared to answer, although I like this format of just dialoguing better, was how did you get interested in inventing? And I was actually thinking about that. I got interested in inventing before I was influenced by Edison or had read any books, or because I'm not actually sure entirely how I got interested in it, but I did have an interest very early in life in magic tricks. And if you think about what magic is, if you put certain materials and procedures in just the right sequence, it creates a magical effect. But ultimately ends up being fairly superficial, because if you reveal some of the secrets behind the magic, it wrecks the magic. But inventions and technology, and creating technology, is a form of magic, particularly if you master the art of the demo. You give a demo of your... it's kind of like a magic show. And it's supposed to have the same impact. But revealing the methods behind technology does not wreck its effect. And ultimately, the more profound technologies have a real impact, lasting impact on the world. So there's a magic to it. There's a magic to any creation. I mean, you put sound in the right sequence, it creates music.
Let me step back to the X factor. I think that the difference between an inventor, and maybe this is just like an imagination that we have, the way we perceive it, inventor and a real top scientist or engineer, is that the inventor still has like the child in him, and still has just a lot of humor and fun, and is doing things for his own purposes and reasons, and not necessarily for money in a business. And I also think that inventors kind of have this ability to either forget that they know something in order to design it better, or they don't know it to begin with, but they are very smart about taking components things are built out of and putting them together in a new way that other people haven't considered, since components have changed or chips have changed in a while, and can kind of come up with a good solution when it's needed. In effect, teach themselves a science rather than having been taught it or learned it and just do it the way it's always been done. And I also think that inventors tend to seek very high levels of quality in their work, things that other human beings wouldn't do, either because it's new or better and fewer pieces than anyone else would do, and maybe they're competing with themselves instead of competing with other people, or just trying to, I think they like to sit down and invent something out of their head and make changes as they go and keep modifying it, and not have the structure of defining exactly what they're going to do on a piece of paper and then doing exactly that and can't vary from it and do anything different. And I also agree with the comment that it should be practical.
Yeah, I also think that inventors tend to have a broad range of interests as well, and I think you will find that all of the gentlemen here have inventions that cover things from biology to nanotechnology to computer chips and mouses and so on. But also inventors feel at home in environments that you wouldn't necessarily think they would be. So me, myself, as a mechanical engineer by training, might feel actually quite at home dealing with a problem that other people might think might not have anything to do with a mechanical engineering solution, being able to address problems in biology or this kind of thing.
And Brian, that touches on multidisciplinary. Inventors tend to sit down and design something and do the drafting themselves, and then put together the breadboard themselves and test it and modify it and rebuild it and lay out the PC board, and they tend to do a lot of different tasks instead of just one small part of it.
Go ahead.
In terms of multiple tasks, I think it's worth noting that, I mean, there's a myth of an inventor who disappears into his or her basement and emerges years later with a breakthrough. And actually, it's a group of inventors who disappear into their basement. Because inventing is very much a group process. There are a few inventions, certainly in today's world, that are done by a single person. They tend to be multidisciplinary. So you've got to gather people from different disciplines who don't share the same terminology. So part of being an inventor is having leadership qualities. I mentioned salesmanship before. I think that's very important. You have to have a vision and really believe in it with such passion that it makes it real and everybody just believes in it and makes it happen regardless of whether venture capital is up or down, and can gather people to go through the difficulty, intellectual, emotional, and otherwise, to bring something to fruition. And then get a group to work effectively together. Generally, an approach I use is to get everybody to throw away their terminology, and we invent a new terminology. It certainly helps in intellectual property protection, because if anybody overhears our conversations, they have no idea what we're talking about. And then I'll try to assign, say, a signal processing problem to the linguist, or vice versa, to try to get some creative new ways of approaching problems.
Steve, you mentioned doing it for the money and not doing it for the money, and I wasn't sure we'd ever get into the money question, but I have two general questions. One, is the world organized in such a way, from your standpoint, to give inventors the right reward for their genius, for their contribution, for their work? And secondly, does the commercial organization of the world bend the ideal process of invention? In other words, looking at this country, I mean, we will probably invent a cure for baldness before we invent a cure for malaria in the third world. And you wonder, is that right? And is it something that inventors worry about? But go back to the first question,
Yeah.
ownership
First
of
of all,
your own work.
Ownership of your own work. Well, first of all, I thought it was about rewards, money or not money was the first part.
Yeah.
So the inventor, this person I think of, is rewarded intrinsically in their own brain, knowing what they're doing is valuable, knowing that it's good, knowing that it's something they want to do, just like solving a crossword puzzle. And it's not extrinsic, where people can see you wearing some fancy clothes, or you live in a nice house, or you have a big salary, or a big title in a company, or you own a company. It's not all those extrinsic rewards. You get a grade for something, and that's really motivating. And I don't think the inventor really needs the money and is doing it for the money, not the pure inventor anyway. I think maybe that comes later. And eventually you wind up with where, well, the number one goal of any company has to be to make money. If you have a good invention, it gets being sold. And so the money kind of determines what the company will pursue. And it's proper, but what happens is if a company, the way companies work in our world is they become a monopoly. They get control of some territory, and then they keep fighting and putting up all the blocks to hold their territory, rather than pursuing newer, better technologies that'll help people more. So that's more where the danger is, rather than companies somehow are just evil and they want to pursue what's going to make money instead of what's not. No, even things that make money, they aren't going to pursue the best ones. They're going to pursue whatever will hold their territory the best.
I'd like to add some things to that. People have been telling me for years that the marketplace is going to take care of how you get organizations to be more effective collectively. And I just point to other things like saying, oh, there's an interesting collective problem called the environment. And it certainly seems like the marketplace is taking care of it in the negative way. And there really are. There are things that the marketplace isn't going to take care of, and somebody with innovation, et cetera, has to start activity that it will.
You mean, what if some inventor could figure out a way to leave the next generation a better environment than we came in with?
Sure. I mean, you can invent all kinds of things.
Well, actually, I have a response to both what was said. I think the rewards are intrinsic, but you need money. Money to inventor is like clay to a sculptor. I mean, it's the necessary ingredient, particularly with the complex projects we have today. In terms of the environment, I think a key issue is sort of the intertwined promise and peril of technology. Technology solves a lot of problems, but it's power that empowers both our creative and destructive sides, and technology can be harnessed for destructive ends as well. And I do think we need to apply more of our creative powers to ameliorating some of the vulnerabilities we have and some of the destructive sides of technology which have emerged.
Specifically
Ray-
how, Ray? What do you mean?
Well, there's several different aspects. I mean, technology is power, and I think the spirit of this panel is very much and of the book, is the extent to which technology has empowered our lives. And I think that's true. If you go back several hundred years, compare our lives today to then, I mean, most of this audience wouldn't even be here because the average life expectancy was 35 years, and most human life was poverty-filled, disease-prone, labor-intensive, short, etc. So we have liberated ourselves to a great extent through technology, but technology also empowers our destructive sides. I mean, the 20th century had 2 great world wars, 100 million people died, certainly amplified and made feasible by technology. And September 11th, we saw technology commandeered, technology of airplanes and skyscrapers, not the most modern technology, but still technology used for destructive purposes. And there has been great concern that has emerged over the potential for technologies that are emerging in the 21st century, which are vastly more powerful than the very powerful 20th century technologies, to be used for destructive purposes. I mean, the same knowledge that will, I believe, cure cancer and overcome many diseases can also be used by terrorists to create a bioengineered pathogen. And some people have said, well, let's do the good technologies and avoid the dangerous ones. Unfortunately, it's the same knowledge, it's the same technology. And I think the only answer really is, I think we need to continue technology development because there's a lot of suffering to be overcome, and there's a lot of benefit to be gained and a lot of creative expression to be harnessed. But I think we need to put a higher priority on addressing the vulnerabilities that some of these new technologies expose, and there are very specific projects that need to be undertaken to do that.
You keep tempting me to ask you like what? Forgive me. What?
Well, I mean, in the wake of September 11th, we can list 100 different ways in which society is vulnerable today. And that itself is a dilemma because the press talks about this. And if, on the one hand, we need that kind of discussion in order to, in a democratic society, to gather the will to do something about these vulnerabilities. On the other hand, if I were a terrorist, I would listen to NPR and read the New York Times, and I'd get a lot of great ideas on. Each one of these vulnerabilities are things we can do, and it's a long discussion to talk about each of them. But even more importantly, some of the new things. I mean, I mentioned the downsides of biotechnology, but there's specific projects, for example, antiviral drugs that could protect against a bioengineered virus. There's some very creative ideas that are emerging, but we need to put a higher priority on addressing the defensive needs of the defensive reaction to some of these technologies.
Well, I'd like to point out that, there's no end of big problems, and somehow getting our society oriented about how to focus on them, which ones are important, is a collective issue that just is falling behind. And the United Nations University put together a project about 6-7 years ago, and they'd publish annually something called the State of the Future. And they were oriented about saying at the turn of the millennium, what are going to be the major challenges to mankind? And so what they published last year then was their sort of final one with listed 15 things that were large, complex issues that basically aren't being centrally addressed by any part of our world yet, but which any of those could bring us down. And so it's like saying, okay, invention in the marketplace does a certain amount of stuff for us, but who's getting out there and being innovative in political, social, other kind of organizational ways that we start addressing these things in some coherent way?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know, it might be a little bit off topic, but it's going back to the inventors need money. Well, it sort of seems like that, but boy, I wouldn't tell that to anyone because it's like saying there's no Santa Claus. You know, I would say there's a lot of people that went and they worked in their basement alone. They felt this incredible thing, and their only purpose was to build something neat for their own farm or their own life, and just, you know, no motivation to sell it or have a company or make a bunch of money. It was really just pure, you know, scientific challenge almost, but to build something that works, and there's a lot of cases of that. I did want to put that point in.
I'd like to ask everybody, all the panelists, and we do want to go to the audience too soon, but you know, in the ultimate basement here, and with young people in mind, what should the next generation of inventors be targeting as sort of doable dreams? Doug Engelbart.
Oh. Boy, that beats me. I've been cemented into one set of large.
They're not going to ask you. They're going to tell you. A person's going to ask you, he's not an inventor.
Yeah, you got something there. I really think there's a sort of a social reorientation that is be important to do about the kinds of issues that really need, in important ways, innovation and energy and commitments. And you know, money making isn't the one that's going to resolve most of those big ones. So, okay, young kids, you know, I've said my wise thing, now it's up to you.
Invent a new social order, in other words.
Well, along those lines, I mean, they say war is too important to leave to the generals, and technology is too important to leave to the technologists. And more so today than existed some decades ago. Technology permeates all of our lives, and you don't need to be an engineer or scientist to understand technology and its impact, or to have a voice in its direction. I will give you a practical example in response to your question a few minutes ago. A lot of the danger of technology has to do with when it's concentrated. So technologies like cities, buildings, nuclear power plants, where you have a lot of power of one sort or another concentrated in a small place, can be quite dangerous. So in the area of energy, we need to move from these very centralized, you know, liquid natural gas facilities and so forth to decentralized ones. And there are quite a few innovative projects I've seen, got involved in one of them, to create decentralized energy, like microscopic fuel cells that can be scaled from everything from cell phone batteries up to powering your homes, that are highly decentralized. In general, decentralized technology is safer. So communicating over the internet is safer than communicating in a city, for example.
Brian, you are the next generation.
Sure.
What's the agenda?
I think you know, if you would indulge me, I'll paint a little picture of the
Please.
future here. I think there are some important areas that the next generation should target, and you know, my specialty happens to be, you know, nanotechnology, and I think that has a lot of promise in various fields. But if one could imagine in the future going to a supermarket and loading up your shopping cart with all the different products, soup cans and cereal boxes and you know, spatulas if the store is stocked that way, and being able to basically walk out of the store, you make no transaction with anybody at any counter, don't stand in any line, and you know, basically each of these little products has a little intelligent tag, a little bit of computer architecture built into it, and allows you to basically walk through that door. The door knows what product that you've actually taken out of the store. It deducts automatically from your credit card, and you get a statement at the end of the month. And this kind of thing is already happening. In fact, when you do this iPass for gasoline purchases at gas stations and so on. So I think part of the dream is to have technology embedded everywhere and making it cheap enough so that you can afford to put it everywhere. I'll give you one example. A car today is manufactured with as many as 20,000 different parts. Keeping track of all those different parts actually adds up to a large portion of the cost that you pay. Inventory management. Imagine if you had a little computer chip that cost some one fraction of a penny and embedded in every bolt and nail and superstructure and hood and aluminum alloy wheel. And that way you would be able to keep track of where all these different parts are at any point in time and be able to assemble them right on the spot. So what do you do in order to achieve this kind of a dream? Well, you need some elements of nanotechnology. How do you pattern things at very, very, very high volume, very cheaply? How do you make disposable cell phones that could be incorporated into credit cards? You basically buy the credit card, it has a cell phone embedded right in it, and you throw it away when you're done. This is, I think, some of the dream that I see. Another is that of you go to the doctor's office and you have basically your genetic information read out in a few minutes on a disposable genetic gene chip. Then you get into some issues of, well, again, technology and then information. There can be a dangerous combination there. But the benefits are that you would be able to have genetic diseases read out and diagnosed within a few minutes. On the other hand, that information could be used against you for insurance policies and so on. So there needs to be a good balance, I think.
Great, thank you, because these are the things for years I look at and say, all these things you can picture the value of innovations in one hand, but they all cause significant changes throughout society as it adapts to them. And it's that, different currents of change like that that are going to come into conflict. Like the things you mentioned about are also going to be there so that everybody's, where they go and what they say and what they do, etc., can be open, just easily tracked. So privacy, it can, has a very hard chance of surviving. Can we adapt our social political structures so that we can put up and maybe turn that to an advantage? But the current society just going to have strong rebellion about that. So can we get ready for that by the time the technology's got it ready to use? And the way we're going now, we're not getting ready for things.
Do we have an answer?
To your question or
To his.
I have one to yours. I think Doug's question is a tough one to answer. It's a very important one. To yours, I think, the way I guess I've looked at that is, I kind of think of inventions from the future in two categories. One are the things that you sort of, I don't want to say can predict today, but I think sort of flow out of things that are happening and will certainly keep people busy for many, many years. It's hard to be specific, but if I kind of look at it and say the medical field, I think that we will probably see in the next 30, 40 years, you'll see what we call personalized medicines, ways of absolutely diagnosing, the genes of mapping of each individual and understanding what that means in terms of a medical regimen that they should get. We'll see drugs, I think, that can have effects on diseases that, including cancer, that really don't exist today. I think we'll see ways of, as Rob was mentioning, of delivering drugs, right to whatever target we want. And I think someday we will see ways of creating new tissues and organs for treat diseases like diabetes and new spinal cords for people who are paralyzed. I think we'll see those. But at the same time, I kind of, and there's no particular direction I'm going when I say this, but I think that some of the greatest inventions will be things that nobody here can foresee. Things that somebody will dream about. Maybe they'll answer Doug's questions or maybe they'll raise more. But those will be inventions that, somebody just totally thinks out of the box. I mean, if you went back, to the turn of the last century, 1900, would people ever dream that we'd have, airplanes, televisions, mini computers, all the kinds of things that we see? I mean, and I think that the same thing will continue to happen. We just don't know where those will come from.
Do you want to make a long shot prediction, or
I think it'd make many
completely unexpected invention?
Well, I'll pick one that we're looking at, just
Okay.
for fun. I mean, which is something that I don't think most people would think about. So, are there ways to even have effects on the weather? In other words, would there be?
I hope not.
Well, but maybe in a positive way, right? There are
we have
things
to
like
talk about
hurricanes that can cause enormous damage and can kill a lot of people. Earthquakes that can kill a lot of people. If you could predict those in ways, or if you could, interfere with those, not necessarily to change it, but if you could, save, many, many lives. I mean, would you want to do that?
We're thinking about.
Okay, so yeah, that's all.
Steve,
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks, Robert. I was just up Haleakala, and I hope that, and it's due to blow, so I hope you hurry up.
We're working at it. We'll get into it. Sorry.
I come from like the personal computer realm, so I think in terms of that as far as future needs for invention directions. And there was a time where we came out with the first personal computers, and we built the programming language in. Somebody could pull it out of the box and learn a few simple steps and solve any problem they had, where the user was totally the master. The machine let them take themselves and gave them more abilities to go further in the world. And then we started working on the computers, the Lisa, and then the Macintosh kind of followed on from that. But with the Lisa, we had some very bright intellectuals at Apple that thought, how do you make a machine that works the way a human wants to? And one thing we did was we had just the blank room and a blank machine, no instructions. Go in and see what you can do to it. We would tell novitiates, people that weren't computer experts. And it had a mouse, and it had different structures, and we'd watch them and learn whether one menu works better than multiple menus, how the window should be shaped, what side of the screen works out better for people, what words in menus are most suggestive so that they find the solutions with no instruction. And we had this little window where the computer was just, like working with the person, like a person, and then that window kind of went away. And now we wind up with complicated programs, and it's hard to figure out where they are, and you have to memorize a series of menu commands rather than just thinking the way a human would think, which is usually Sarah, Dennis, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Write it down. Little products that do that sort of thing, they kind of come and they go, and they get lost, and the technologies don't come back. And we wind up with what we have today is error messages that you can't understand and other dialogues you can't understand, and the checkboxes work like radio buttons, and radio buttons work like checkboxes, like nobody cares about consistency, and you check a box and some words change somewhere to change a meaning, and you never knew it would have happened. And you can see where you are, but not where you came from, and it's like we have this pretty much a mess, and I keep thinking in terms of humanization. It's always been important to me, and a lot of what Ray did in his past, I think, just try to solve some real human being problems, like even a piano sounding right, or what do you need for a blind person to read a normal book, and what technologies do you have to invent to do it? And it's like humans versus technology, and the humans should be more important. And it's like I feel like we're kind of losing out, and we're not in as good a place as we'll be someday. So I think that now that we're getting kind of close to where people have the amount of computer in their homes and businesses that they need, and we don't really need a lot of new computers, and new devices don't seem to be coming out, maybe after a period of stability we'll go back and reevaluate the human interface again and start going back and searching for these things where the computer is like a human and works with us that way. Artificial intelligence, I hope will be, a little bit of the key to that. So, thanks.
Ray.
I'll mention a couple of things I see happening, starting with this decade. One important phenomenon is virtual reality. Now, we can have virtual meetings today on the internet, but they don't have the immediacy that we have here. We can't look at each other's faces. We don't have the ability to express ourselves. Video conferencing does a little bit of this, but you actually can't establish eye contact in video conferencing, and it doesn't have the resolution. But by the end of this decade, we will be able to meet very much like this, with this sense of presence, with eye contact, with three-dimensional, full immersion, visual, auditory, virtual reality, with images written on our retina directly from our eyeglasses and lenses. These are technologies you can see today on this campus and other campuses in prototype form. They're not quite high enough resolution and not ready for prime time. But by the end of this decade, that will be a common way that we meet. The telephone is auditory virtual reality. We'll be adding the visual sense by the end of this decade. Interfaces will have a lot more facility with human language, which is how we like to communicate. We'd like to be able to just say what's on our mind. And there are systems emerging. They're not quite good enough yet, but they are, within some domains, beginning to work. And certainly by the end of this decade, systems will be able to understand what you want, at least within limited domains. They won't be passing the Turing test, so we won't mistake them for human intelligence, but they will understand what we want for an e-commerce transaction, scheduling an appointment, a reservation, finding information. If we go out past the end of this decade to 20, 30 years from now, the virtual reality systems will go inside our brains using nanotechnology. All of this has already been demonstrated in prototype form, the ability for electronics to interact actually non-invasively with our biological neurons. And we'll ultimately be able to have full immersion virtual reality incorporating all of the senses. People can then beam their whole flow of sensory experiences out on the internet, and you can plug in and experience what it's like to be someone else, a la the plot concept of being John Malkovich. Which most experiences I think are pretty boring, but
Well, the closest thing to that happening that I know of is I got this new arcade machine called Police 911, and you sit there and somehow it senses where your body is. You stand on this pad, and as you move around, the screen moves, and you can duck behind cop car doors and things like that. So it's coming.
I'd like to this is the moment when we go to calls, as we say, 1-800, and but also, I was just thinking of the late, great Michael Dertouzos of the computer lab at MIT in an office not far from here. I mean, he thought a lot about making computers and making technology more humane and more human-centered, and in his office, he could give a kind of spoken instruction to his curtains, and they would open or close, and he could ask his telephone what the traffic was like in Phoenix right now, or the weather in Bhutan or someplace. But he thought a lot about making technology serve human beings rather than, as Steve is saying, put us all on these long lists of indecipherable instructions. I'd love to know what the inventors, but also what all of us think are the kind of human. What does that actually mean nowadays to make our technology more humane? Are there inventors who want to sort of speak to that, and then we'll go to...
Well, some, because I've been very, very concerned and interested, and I'm not trying to stop the innovations of technology, but two things. One is the implications in the rest of our society for every one of these families of things that's brought out and installed. They're going to make lots and lots of changes. Are we up? I come around over and over again then to this collective smarts, that's one thing that technology can provide a lot of improvement, but we don't get it by just plugging in smart machines. We're going to get it by adapting and changing a lot about the way we think and collaborate and work together, and to me that's something extremely important to get going on, to try to cope. And there are lots of opportunities.
Bob, did you want to comment?
I had nothing specific, but I guess I do think, some of the things you can do in medicine, lots of people are doing, some were again mentioned in the introduction by Rob, really, I mean, they provide, I think, great things in terms of, you see sometimes little children who would die before, and now I think we're able to hopefully create things that'll make people live longer and, better lives. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on that I think hopefully help.
I mean, I will say, generally, there needs to be much more public education about science and technology and its impact so that we can make intelligent decisions. Technology is going to have enormous impact on our lives. The next big revolution is in biotechnology, with our harnessing information about the genome and proteomics and so on. We're going to be able to extend human lifespan, which has been growing, extend human aging, overcome any diseases, but there's also tremendous potential for danger, particularly of this kind of knowledge in the wrong hands, and the things we can do about that. I don't think we're defenseless. I think we have to put resources into technological immune systems and safeguards, and it requires really the public to guide these efforts.
Here we are. Please. Do you want to tell us who you are?
I don't know.
You don't have to.
My name's Jan Walker. I met Doug years ago when we were both working on the same kind of problem. Now, what I hear here is really classic technologists, inventors of technology, talking about how to solve problems with humans, or problems that humans have. But with my hats off to all of you, and I use a Macintosh and mouse, I think the kinds of inventions that are really most important are the kind Doug is talking about, and those are social inventions. Technical inventions we have tons of. We understand how to market technical inventions. What we need now are social inventions, and we haven't got a clue. Doug's been crying in the wilderness now for 20, 30 years about this, and words just go by people who immediately start thinking, well, how can we use a computer to do that? Or how can we build video conferencing where we smell each other to do that? But the really important question seems to me is how you get that social construction together that says, here we have things that people need to do collectively. How do we enhance the collective intellectual capital that's going into these problems, solving these problems? Forget technology. That might or might not be a path to enabling that. But unless you decide first that your problem is to solve the social construction invention side of it, you're not going to get to where you need to go. And so I want to see, you know,
The point is,
lot of
well,
that,
it's a
though,
good question. It's a
addresses-
great question.
That addresses involving changing personalities of people to deal with each other differently, and personalities are pretty, you know, pretty stable and transient from a certain age on. So we've got to be talking probably about how we raise children or something, or maybe school environments.
Well, I think there is an interaction between technology and the kind of human values and social structures that you're talking about. And I think you have to be mindful of them, and we have to talk about improving political systems and social systems in the context of the acceleration of technology. I had to get the word acceleration in there. If you take an example, I think the internet is a very profound, and decentralized electronic communication in general is a very profound, has a very profound influence on the world, both positive and negative, but the positive is worth noting in that it is a very democratizing force because it keeps everybody informed. I mean, during that 1991 coup against Gorbachev, it really wasn't Yeltsin standing bravely on a tank that overturned the coup. It was the clandestine, decentralized electronic communication so that the totalitarian government couldn't just seize the TV and radio station and keep everyone in the dark. Everybody was communicating through early forms of email on teletype machines, faxes, and other forms of decentralized electronic communication. And the internet now is creating a global culture that is much more important than national boundaries, and products, information bounces around the internet instantly. My kids have friends around the world and create these communities. It is I think it's behind the trend towards democracy we saw in the 1990s. There are a lot of negative aspects too. It also spreads hatred, can provide means for people to communicate in clandestine ways to plan malicious projects. And so, I mean, there are privacy issues, particularly as this technology becomes more pervasive.
But John, excuse me if I may say, it seems to me you're asking a somewhat different question, which is what is the moral equivalent in the social realm of inventors in the technological realm? And they're not the same thing. I mean, maybe what you're looking for is maybe the inventor you're looking for is a politician,
Or a psychologist.
or a revolutionist, or a
I understand the point, and I believe that one of the problems we have in facing the future is that we understand how to build and market things. But we don't understand a whole lot about building whatever else it is we need, like consensus across national borders, whatever. But I do think
But
that
Ray is saying there is a connection to democracy, for example.
invention, and I think that's the kind of enhancement of human capabilities that Doug's technology is addressing. That's where his inventions have been targeted. But it's very hard to explain, and I'd like to hear how that kind of invention can be fostered with the other kinds we have already.
Yeah, sure. I think I was going to agree that you know, I think inventors have a particular role to play. And in many ways, you know, scientists and engineers have particular roles to play. And I think the questions that you're addressing and the challenges that you've posed are of such global nature, and in fact are you know, require the a battalion of thousands, if not millions, to make it happen. Whole changes in psychology. I think, as Ray has mentioned, the broadband internet and so on will allow us to understand what people are thinking and talk with them maybe on nearly a daily basis, a world away. That's tremendous. But I think inventors have a particular role, and our role is to look at the world and to say, to wake up in the morning and say, that's a really interesting reflection in the pool of water that's sitting outside my window. Is there any way that I can use that for telecommunications? Okay, I mean, it's an odd combination of things, but perhaps, the invention of fiber optic cable comes from viewing this problem. So I think inventors maybe are a little more specific and centralized in their thinking. I mean, my thinking is when I take a shower and I'm staying at a four-star hotel, thank you very much, Lemelson Program, in Boston, I expect all the fine amenities, and that's really wonderful. Of course, I lived in a pretty crappy dorm here at MIT when I went to school, so this is tremendous. But I wake up in the morning and I try to shave, and you know what? The mirror is all fogged up. And what's my inventive solution? Well, I take a piece of Kleenex and clean all of the, wipe off all of the condensation. Why isn't there a defroster? I mean, they've got a heated towel rack, okay? Why isn't there a defroster on my mirror? So, I would love to address the big global problems, but I think bit by bit, if each inventor does his work, and for that matter, each scientist and engineer does their work for an inventor to feed off of, realistically, we're adding little pieces to the technological puzzle.
Oh.
And I think those get put together with, somebody with politics and companies and money and finances, and then we build a consensus about what we want to do about the big global questions.
Well, just a quick comment, because we did talk about this at lunch. We had lunch together, and there's a difference between innovation and invention. I mean, invention harnesses innovation in the area of technology, but innovation is something that pervades fields other than invention. The arts, politics, psychology, teaching can all be innovative, and I think your point is we need innovation in other fields. In the political and social fields, we need more insight into human psychology. And my point earlier was that this is even more important because of the profound and rapidly escalating impact that technology is having on our human issues.
Well, I just point out that that's the motivating thing starting me out 50 years ago, with the complexity and urgency is going to grow, and we only can deal with it collectively. So there are things of changes in the way we think and work and collaborate, and the computers and the communication can make big differences in that. And that's, constructive innovation is.
I see a lot of hands out here. Be as incisive and quick as you can, please.
Maybe the companies that produce the inventions, maybe the inventors themselves might need to take responsibility for the impacts of the invention. Is that a possibility? For example, if a company makes a product and that product's disposable and we have limited resources, maybe the company needs to take responsibility for the disposal of the product, or the costs involved with disposal, or the costs involved with exhaust, or the costs involved with the impacts of the product. I'm wondering if there is a connection between the social implications and the invention itself.
Okay. Name a company and a kind of product in which there ought to be somebody to deal with the end product of the invention, to sort of...
Let's say you're inventing a car. You're inventing a car. And you as the inventor of the car, you're going to be responsible for the exhaust, the pollution that's created by that car, which today you're not. In the world of invention, you hand over your invention and you're done.
Every inventor should come with sort of a cleanup guy.
Well, there should be a connection between the ethics, the implications, some of the impacts of the invention, and the inventor.
I mean, I think that's a good thought. We have a little bit of that in terms of liability. If people cause certain types of damage, they can be sued, and there are regulations in areas of impact on the environment. But I think that's the direction we need to move into, because technology does have a very pervasive effect. And I've proposed that we actually create specific programs to, in a sense, clean up some of the dangers that are created by new technologies. We've suddenly woken up have a list of 100 different vulnerabilities we have just with conventional technology, and the new ones that are emerging are also a double-edged sword. So we need to deal with that.
The car puts out pollution.
Steve.
To the extent that we don't want pollution, well, somebody has to pay for it, but it's really the person buying the car. It has an extra cost. It has the cost of the car and the cost of the cleanup, and the price tag should be put on the car. But if any one company tries to do that, every other company is going to sell cheaper cars. So obviously the solution is somewhere above a company, above an inventor. It's like political or something.
Please,
This is on.
speak up.
Hi, this is on another question that was asked earlier about the qualities to create an inventor. What about the question of chaos? I have found that inventors are willing to go into that realm of chaos, but I also think that the end result that we're talking about is also filled with a chaos that reverberates out, into when you have a new invention. Can you say something about chaos?
Sort of Pandora's box, you mean?
Yeah, just the process of being willing to engage with it.
Well, I think what inventors try to do is perhaps bring order to chaos. An inventor might go into a conference on materials research or on nanotechnology or this or that. And I think we'll be able to take various ideas that might not necessarily initially seem connected and put them together into a new way and bring order to this kind of chaos of ideas. I think that's what you do anytime that you sit down with a bunch of people and basically brainstorm. You're bringing in all these ideas from all these different directions, creating something concrete. And then you got to bring it to the next step, and that's to ask the question, okay, this is interesting. What are we going to do with it?
I think that the brightest, most admirable inventors are the ones that invent things in a way that reduces the chaos instead of increasing it, but gives you just as much capability.
Another comment on chaos. My own technical field is something called pattern recognition, which is really the study of chaos and finding patterns in very chaotic information, like looking out in a scene and seeing this very chaotic swirl of visual information, but being able to make some sense out of it. And that's actually the heart of human intelligence. And probably the most profound new technological capability that will emerge in this century is machines with increasing amounts of human-like intelligence, which is based on this ability to find patterns in chaos.
Please, in the far.
Mr. Engelbart has been talking a lot about how his work has focused on helping people deal with increasing complexity. And at the time that he was beginning his work, it seems like that was a much less obvious problem than it is now. So I was wondering if there was anything specific that led him to take his research in that direction.
Can you rephrase that?
What was it about complexity that got you hooked 50 years ago? Why complexity?
Was there something specific that you saw in the world that led you to understand this complexity? I mean, understand this sort of increasing problem?
If I tell you, it'll reveal this very country boy naivete that I started a couple of months before that. I happened to get engaged the weekend, and driving to work on Monday, I thought, well, I'm going to get married and have kids and live happily ever after, and that's all very great. And suddenly I started aligning myself to thinking about the work. And for some strange reason, all I saw was an empty hallway, nicely lit, going on down forever. And I just realized with a real shock, I didn't have any real professional goals. And before the day was out, I tried different goals, and I latched on to one that I'm embarrassed to tell you about. It's like saying, why don't I invest my career to maximize the return and benefits to mankind? Honest. So, I spent the next few months trying to figure out what kind of a crusade to go on. And that's when I began to realize how complex the world is. And you hear stories about saying, oh boy, here these natives are living in a way where the swamps get so much mosquitoes and malaria is crippling them and everything else. We'll go in and we'll clear the swamps. Well, great. Then 30 years later, they've overpopulated the area and they've ruined the environment and they're worse off. See, so you say, okay, how do I design a crusade whose results have a chance of really helping rather than the secondary effects of it being worse? or something. And it's very complex organizing a crusade anyway. You say, well, I need a business manager. I go down the streets looking for business managers of crusades, and they don't seem. So one Saturday I just thought, oh, God, you know, it's just really very, very complex. And somehow that all came together pretty soon as, yes, complex, the problems are getting more and more complex and urgent that have to be dealt with collectively, and our ability to deal collectively with complex, urgent problems isn't improving as fast as the complexity and urgency are. So where's that going to leave us? So the naive country boy says, oh, that'll be what I'll commit a career to. And one thing led to another, so I get all these images about how we actually can change our way of thinking and interacting, and our vocabulary is going to change, and the very symbols we use to portray those concepts are going to start evolving and changing because we can portray them in such different ways, dynamically, etc. And the old-fashioned way of that's the way you should get your knowledge, is looking at a page. And that's still out there. And I says, hey, boy, that's the result of a very old technology to have symbols put on there like that. So how can I put them on dynamically in color and shift to views of how I want them? So I just feel like there's a great deal to learn about how we can deal with all of that and improve our ability collectively to develop knowledge in ways in which we can really very rapidly put it together. And we don't have to wait till you publish the next textbook, et cetera. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. Please.
To address what Brian was saying earlier, I haven't seen a hotel in Japan that has the defogger in the mirror. But this brings, I guess that's the point of, you know, what is involved with the wisdom of using inventions. Obviously that invention's there. And then the other thought I had was, is there wisdom in not inventing something? Do we really want to make this other life form, for example, artificial intelligence, that may be as intelligent as us, but let's just say a lot of the wisdom to use it properly?
I mean, that's been a debate recently. One forum was kicked off by a cover story that Bill Joy wrote in Wired magazine that some of you may have seen. And he and I have been paired as sort of optimist and pessimist around that issue, which is probably an oversimplification. But I think my point is not that we're embarked on a project specifically to create artificial intelligence, but it's an inevitable result of lots of little steps, each of which is quite conservative and makes sense by itself. A little bit faster computer, software that's more responsive than the kind of frustrating software that Steve was describing. But the inevitable result of hundreds of these steps is artificial intelligence. We're not specifically sitting down and creating nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is the inevitable end result of hundreds of projects which make things a little smaller. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate. And the inevitable result of that is that 10, 20 years from now, most technology will have its key features measured in nanometers. And the inevitable end result of faster computers and more sophisticated software, and software that understands language better, motivated by wanting to have better user interfaces, all of which are economic imperatives. I mean, if a company says, well, you know, an AI might be dangerous, therefore I'm not going to create more intelligent software, we'll be out of business because there's an economic imperative to it. And I pointed that out to Bill Joy. I mean, Sun is continuing to create more intelligent software and faster computers and more powerful networks because it's an economic imperative.
So how?
Doug, you want to?
Yeah, so it's an economic imperative driven by business, which is fine and good like that, but it still is going to create real problems that today we wouldn't have a clue as how we would cope with that. So if you get more and more things that are being created that are smarter than people, why the hell should they pay much attention to us? Pretty soon, if they're smart enough, they'll get together and say, who needs these creatures?
Well, I think it's a real issue. I mean, if you describe today to people 200 years ago, particularly if you emphasize some of the negatives, enough explosive power to end all mammalian life and all the other dangers that we live with, they would think it's crazy to go down that path. But we didn't get here by embarking on a single project to create the present world. It's done step at a time, and there are profound benefits.
Can I add something, though?
Well,
Just
let me
not
finish. And I think there is a moral imperative, not just an economic imperative, to continue technology development, because there's still not millions, but billions of people who are suffering from poverty and disease and other afflictions which technology can and will overcome. So there's plenty of moral reason to continue technology, and technology is a double-edged sword, so we do have to address this negative side, but I think it's unrealistic to think that we're not going to continue moving forward.
Well, can I just?
Yep, please.
That yes, no one's saying stop it to do those cures. The thing is,
People are saying it. I mean,
well,
that
I'm
is
not. I'm just saying that if we don't get smarter about how we handle it, and the things you talk about how the technology over the last 2 centuries has changed, well, all that change has happened at a very slow rate because technology evolved relatively very slowly, and our society has a sort of a time constant about how it adjusts and adapts and everything like that. If we
Before Ray
exceed
answers that thought, I want to change the subject.
I think this is one of the most important problems that will be facing basically everybody here in our lives is this issue that our ability to create and invent technology surpasses humans' ability psychologically and socially to ingest and deal with that technology. And my question is, what examples can you think of, if any, in human history? Because I imagine that this is a trend that's gone on since we began inventing technology, which is a long time ago. What are the best examples that you can think of in human history where ability psychologically and socially to ingest and comprehend and use technological advancements has leapt forward quickly? So have there been quantum leaps ever in human history in our ability to deal with technology? And if so, were those pushed along by technology, or do they emerge for some other reason? Do you understand that question?
Well, I mean, I would give the example of the internet as.
The question was roughly examples of speedy and happy adaptation of technology to the social order.
Speedy and happy actual advances in human understanding
Okay.
of technology, whether that was motivated by any technology or not.
Well, I think the internet is a very profound development. It emerges from the technological world, but it's had profound impact on every other sphere, certainly education, politics, and it's an enormous communication vehicle, and it's not a static thing. It's going to increase in its realism, and it's fundamentally a communication medium where we can communicate with other people, and our ability to do that over this worldwide network is going to increase, and it's creating communities that are global, and it's creating kind of a global culture and society that has a lot of impacts that are not specifically technological. And also, while it's true that technology is accelerating, a profound trend is that technology is becoming more human. I mean, the first computers were behind glass walls, and then Steve helped usher in the personal computing revolution, where computers then were sitting on our desks, and then ultimately we were carrying them under our arm as notebooks, and now we're putting them in our pockets, and ultimately they're going to be woven in our clothing, and they're going to communicate more in human ways. So it doesn't necessarily require humans to become more technologically savvy in order to use technology. It's becoming more like us and becoming more intertwined with our lives, and allows us to do things that aren't specifically technological. So when teenage kids are creating new music and sharing music using technology, that's a non-technological impact of sophisticated technology, and we're going to see that more and more. I'd say overall the internet has been a very positive thing.
Are there other examples that people want to cite
Sure.
of sort of happily?
Yeah, I mean, I'm younger than anybody here in the panel and may have a little bit of naivete, but so I'm kind of an eternal optimist really about technology. I have a much more rosy view on what can happen in the future simply by looking at what has happened in the past. I mean, I think anybody here in this audience would have, a hard time arguing against the notion that your life today is much better than it could have been maybe, only 70 or only 50 years ago. Again, the example that Ray had given, 200 years ago, you might be dead already because the lifespans were so short back then. I think this is a trend that's going to continue on into the future. I think, we brought up the notion that perhaps the advances in technology will somehow outstrip our ability to control it or understand it or be able to use it in good and wise ways. But I think in the past we've seen that we've been able to overcome those problems. I mean, the development of the atomic bomb, for gosh sakes. In the end, yes, okay, we got close to the edge, perhaps one could say. But in the end, we're able to work out those differences, those problems, find technological solutions, find political solutions, find sociological solutions for this kind of thing. So one example, cars today, okay, it took 20 years to do it. A car today puts out about 1/100th of the pollution that a car did only 20 years ago. That has had a profound effect on atmospheres worldwide. Now, of course, we have many more cars. That's a big problem, okay, but it's better.
But a two-cycle lawnmower puts out 200 times as much as one car.
This is true. This is true.
Stand up and shout.
My question is, if necessity is the mother of invention, is necessity a limited resource like capacity? And what I mean by that is that in order to invent new things, to sell a new product, you have to be meeting some sort of need. And for every need, there is like an asymptote. There's like an endpoint of that need, I think. What I mean is cures for disease. If we cure every possible disease, we master every biological process, we could live forever. If we create artificial intelligence that can translate any language for us, we no longer need to learn any language aside from a basic set of commands to activate this thing that will translate for us. And I'm wondering, is there a way in which technology is making us, and this is really from a Western viewpoint where, we create more needs because we need a Palm Pilot, but we really need that to survive. But I'm wondering, are there technologies that could be invented that would increase our cognitive abilities, that would make us more human? I mean, we talk about how 200 years ago we had a better quality, or a worse quality of life. So that's very relative.
But is your question that, are you worried that we're running out of needs and necessity?
Well, in a sense, we're creating more needs and necessities through our innovation, and I'm just wondering, how is that making us less human in the process? So, I mean,
He's asking whether or not human need is a finite resource. And in my view, the uniquely human thing is to seek broader horizons. What need was Beethoven trying to fulfill, and is that finite? I mean, ultimately, our human civilization is creating knowledge, and by knowledge I include art and music and invention and literature and human discourse and our political systems. And human knowledge, you can actually measure it, is growing exponentially. And I think as we overcome some of our afflictions, people can become more creative. There's no limit to the amount of knowledge we can seek, and the more we know we don't know.
Please.
About the inventions with a capital I. As we speak, at the other end of campus, they're showing the latest gadgets, the infrared pen and the new Tickle Me Elmo. Is the process of inventing a gadget like that any different than the process of a new drug for cancer? And can you tell as an inventor whether you're coming up with a gimmick or not? How often can you tell?
I think the truly important and innovative, the kinds of inventions that really have impact. Okay, probably it's not going to be the laser pen or the Tickle Me Elmo. For the following reason, I think truly innovative inventions take advantage of some effect, some noticing of something happening in the environment around you. Oftentimes it comes from the field of physics, or that comes from the field of biology or neurobiology. noticing how drugs interact from each other. So I think those are the kinds of inventions that will have true impact and eventually wind up being the foundations upon which we build gimmicks.
Please.
I have a question about the pace of change. There's an assumption I think that most of us make that underlie a lot of the questions that people have been asking. That things are getting different much faster. Things used to get different. There was an article in the New Yorker a few months back that compared the world from 1900 to 1950 to 2000. The world in 1950 was almost completely unimaginable. It was all living in 1900. Cars, airplanes, trains, mass urbanization. It was a very, very different world. Someone born in 1870 who lived through that change suffered really huge societal changes in the way people use technology. 1950 2000, the differences are actually much less. Planes, trains, large cities, with the obviously notable exception of the computer. The world 2000 really isn't that much different except quantitatively. So I sort of would like to hear people's opinion on that question. You can go on and answer the debate, but more profoundly, is that an accident in the last 50 years? I know, I can guess what Ray Kurzweil's answer is going to be about what the next 50 years, how different that will be, but I'd like to hear the other panels.
Bob Langer surprised him with an answer.
Yeah, I wish I had a good one. I kind of thought, I think I know what you're saying. I mean, you're saying like between 1900 and 1950 there was this, giant thing, and what's happened the last 50 years. But I don't know. I mean, I think an awful lot has happened the last 50 years too. So it's hard for me to say. I mean, if I compared the last 50 years to any other 50 years, I would think it would still be a pretty giant thing. It's just that particular 50 years, at least as, some of those events like, cars and planes and all that was, it's a pretty big deal. I guess I still think there's going to be an awful lot ahead of us as well. I mean, whether it'll do exactly those 50 years, hard to know. And that's kind of a dramatic thing. Sometimes, the foundations are laid, and those foundations are laid before, and then all of a sudden these kind of spectacular things that you envision, jump out at you. But it's not necessarily because, there's, like they say, the science or the engineering may have happened even before that. It's just that that's what we see. I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Rick, you want to give him the answer that he knew you were going to give?
Yeah, I'll give you the answer you expected. But, I mean, first of all, cars have emerged before 1900, as did trains. And the world changed between 1900 and 1950, but I don't know that it was that profound. I think it's changed a lot more between 1950 and now. I have studied this issue for quite some time, and have measured quantitatively certain technological trends. I mean, if you look at certain measurements that you can do quantitatively, like computational power, communication speed, our knowledge about the human brain and the ways of measuring that, our biological knowledge, the size of technology, all of these different facets are growing at remarkably smooth exponential rates, despite the chaos. I mean, I have these various charts where you put these different projects and measure them in certain ways, and they form these very smooth exponential curves, despite the fact that each point on those curves is a function of tremendous chaos and competition and venture capital and human drama. Nonetheless, the powers of these technologies are growing exponentially. If you look at what you're alluding to, which is sort of the pace of technical change, the rate of paradigm shift, as I call it, I've plotted that as well, and that is also growing exponentially. We're roughly doubling the paradigm shift rate every decade. And that goes back to the dawn of technology, where the first steps took thousands or tens of thousands of years, like stone tools, fire, the wheel. And then 1,000 years ago, things like printing and ships took centuries to take hold. And now we have paradigm shifts like the World Wide Web that take root in just a few years' time. So there is an exponential growth to the pace of technology, which means that the next 25 years we'll see 100 years of change at today's rate of change, which is why some of the social issues discussed here are urgent, because the pace of change is speeding up. I think that's clear.
Please.
I'm Peter Metz at the Center business here in this Sloan School. I want to bring in some discussion of a process called commercialization. I think it's terribly important to help people invent or reach what impact inventions have. And what I want to postulate is that no invention goes anywhere unless it can succeed in the process of commercialization. To go back to the telegraph, which is probably the invention that had the most profound impact on the way society worked. It was the first time that information could travel at faster than the speed of a horse. And its inventors at the time thought that it would revolutionize the world. There's a wonderful book called The Victorian Internet, which is really called the telegraph. But it didn't work until it was a commercial success, and Samuel Morse was the inventor amongst a whole bunch of competing inventors who came up with a version of the telegraph that could be commercialized. So I'd like to hear from our panelists about how you think invention interacts with commercialization. What lessons can you learn from your experience with commercialization of your invention? And what lessons are there for the issues that have been raised about societal impact? Because commercialization is the way that inventions really impact people, and maybe that's where we need to deal with what are the societal impacts rather than the invention process.
The entrepreneurs can be considered the heroes of invention. To point out maybe somewhat of a sobering fact for all you budding inventors out there, something like only 1 out of 100 patents actually gets turned into something. And maybe only 1/100th of those actually turns into something useful. And maybe 1/100th of those actually becomes something useful that people want. So in many ways, I think, we talked about cash as being the commodity of necessity for an inventor to take his idea to the next step. I think a lot of credit does need to go, in fact, to the entrepreneurs out there that are willing to risk their own capital, their own reputations, and so on, to turn a very, very risky idea into something new and novel, and hopefully something that can change, society.
Please, on the side.
Yeah. Speaking about the inventing and the complexity of modern world, I have one wish that inventors would start, instead of going more towards complexity, that they would reverse and go to simplicity. So anybody can use, somebody mentioned the car has so many thousands parts. Mm-hmm. Well, why is it? Why we need all those parts? If we could reverse it and use fewer parts and show the genius really in the making things simpler, not anybody can put another button on a car and put 10 more parts and so on. So that's my wish.
I think that can be addressed at least in some particular areas today. I'll give you, one example. The fabrication of a computer chip today is unbelievably complex. A typical plant, like an Intel plant, to produce a typical Pentium, might run between $1 and $2 billion for one factory. And that's supposed to be 3 or 4 billion by 2 years from now, and maybe 10 billion by 6 years from now. Complexity upon complexity upon complexity in order to achieve the end result. So, one of the things that I've been working on is how do you, in fact, make a computer chip, but do it in 10 steps, fabricate it in 45 minutes. So there are people that are working on the simplification of things. And when it comes to the manufacture of a car, I think a lot of those innovations will come from material science. A lot of the reasons why you need a lot of parts in a car is that steels and aluminums aren't nearly as strong and robust and as rigid as they would need to be. Carbon nanotubes, which are a new materials development coming out and being discussed at various conferences worldwide, offer the possibility for the first time you really could think of building an elevator between, the Earth and the Moon, and it would be, structurally have great integrity. So, and the same kind of technology could be implemented for the building of, maybe even injected molded airplanes or extruded cars. Fewer parts, absolutely.
Please. Speak up.
Mary Hopper, Comparative Media Studies. There's just a point of irony. I've been a fan of Doug's for a long time, and I think it's incredibly ironic, which maybe half the audience must realize, maybe not, that in fact he was introduced as the inventor of the mouse in this context, which is maybe one of the most extreme examples of the context of his more, that would contextualize his more important invention of something I'd like to retroactively introduce him as an inventor of augment. Nobody's actually said this, but he invented, and I think it was brought up a little bit earlier without specifically saying it, by somebody who worked with him in the past, but augment is about the idea of an invention. In fact, it's also behind the invention of the web, and usually it's attributed to Ted Nelson and Vannevar Bush and Doug. But even beyond that, his real point was how can we make a technological enhancement to human intelligence to let us cope better with everything that we've done. And in fact, the invention of the mouse is actually an ironic introduction, I think, in the context of the discussion that we've seen, because he actually is best known for having, in the hypertext community, invented a system for handling these issues of the escalation of knowledge and the management of it. In fact, he's the inventor of knowledge management in many ways as well.
Irony noted. Thank you. Please.
A question for all of the panelists. Do you feel that today's patent and intellectual property laws help or hinder the development of new inventions in our technological society?
Well, I think it's a very important issue, and you need intellectual property to some extent to protect the creation so that you can attract the capital to create them in the first place. On the other hand, there is a real issue in patent law, which has a fixed 20 years. I mean, it's bounced back and forth between 17 and 20, but it's approximately 20 years of protection, and the significance of 20 years is changing profoundly. 20 years ago was an interesting amount of time, but today you're talking about being able to protect maybe some basic concept through many revolutions of technology. And as we go forward, the significance of 20 years is going to become greater and greater. So I do think we need to revisit that. And there's, because of the complexity of technology, a lot of patents get issued that really don't deserve patent protection, because someone has done something on a computer and then they say, well, I'm doing the same thing but on the web, and then they create a patent. And you probably could contest that, but because of the vagaries of jury trials, where juries don't really understand the technology, the patent has power anyway. So I think we need to revisit some of the aspects of patent protection. We have a fixed 20 years, despite the fact that the significance of time is changing.
You speak specifically to patenting in the medical world. Is too much stuff patentable?
Well, I think that also is an evolving thing. I think that I think by and large what happens is pretty good. In other words, I think it's a somewhat self-correcting system, but it takes time to correct itself. So what happens is, there may be things that, and this has certainly come up with the genome, that gets patented or allows to get patented that maybe shouldn't. But I think people start to realize what might have been obvious, in other words, what was obvious today is different, 10 years ago, and it will be different 10 years from now. So it's a question of people catching up with that system. And so I think in most cases things are pretty good in medicine, but I think that there's got to be a continuing re-examination, education for examiners and so forth to really figure out what's obvious and to really interpret that in an intelligent way. But I still feel overall it's reasonable.
Can we take one more question and then quit while we're still hungry? Please.
Yes, I'm kind of curious if the panelists have an idea of what the ultimate goal of humanity is. You look
We'll let you answer that, Chris.
Our other person over here suggested that the mouse is an augmenting invention. Others may or may not be. And I wonder if we're still, as inventors, have the ultimate goal of humanity or unultimate goal of humanity in mind. Or are we just looking more short-term each time we do it? As basically the life cycle of these inventions changes and whatnot. Are we just looking at how to make better cell here or a better drug here, as opposed to thinking more along the lines of, well, what drugs in the world are needed to make humanity better?
Well, the ultimate goal of humanity must be to smile more and frown less. So we kind of aren't touching that.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I'm quite happy frowning sometimes. And there are probably some drugs we could take where we'd smile all the time, and I'm not sure that's the goal. The one thing that's, I think the key thing that separates Homo sapiens from other species is our accumulating knowledge base. Other species communicate, they do use tools, but none of that evolves, and they don't have a growing species-wide shared knowledge base that evolves over time and reflects a dialogue among all the members of that species. We're the only species that does that, and that knowledge includes such grand things as music and art, and as well as all the other kinds of conversations that we have. And in my mind, that is the goal of humanity, is to continue that species-wide dialogue and create more profound knowledge.
Bob Langer.
Well, yeah, just to deal with the medicine specifically, but I think in a larger sense, what I'll say I think is true for most people. Here, I'm not necessarily speaking for myself, but more as an MIT professor who sees students come in and what drives them. And I think what drives them isn't to make one new thing, or I think it is to make the world a better place, to make people healthier. Let's say if that's the area they choose to study, it may come out that maybe they do one thing. But I think the broad driving forces that I see so many students, postdocs and scientists come in, and I think that's what drives most inventors, is that they want to see something good happen. And I think they do have, long-term benefit in mind. That may not be true for everybody, but I think it's probably true for most people.
Right. I think, my dream, I think, is actually coming true to a large extent, thanks to the internet and broadband. People are talking, and I think that's the foundation of how to solve a lot of these global, worldwide problems. People are talking. And what language are they speaking? Well, it is true that you can communicate across, sociological and political and maybe even biological boundaries with, for example, music. But there is another common language, and I think there is one of that, of invention. You show some person invention 1 and then maybe a superior invention number 2. There may be some consensus that number 2 is actually better than number 1, and maybe we can create one that's a number 3 that's even better than number 2. So I think there is a common dialogue, and the language is invention, the language is engineering, the language is science.
Doug, you get the last word.
Wow. I had 1 wife and 3 daughters, and I was not used to having the last word. Well, I think what you're talking about accumulating knowledge, et cetera, is very much akin to what I feel is an important aspect that needs a lot more attention specifically for how we do develop our common knowledge. And the rate, if the world knowledge doubles every 6 months, what are our schools going to do? And everybody that's out working in a job, how are they going to get retreaded? So, they're just huge changes that are coming about, and we're not lining up.
My answer to your question is that the mission is to keep the conversation going with accumulating information all the time, but then also to know when to stop. I have to leave, but thank you very, very much for your attention. It's been an honor to be among you.